Hello everyone, my name is Ben and I teach people about the anatomy and biomechanics of lifting weights. Today we're going to talk specifically about Arnold's top 3 chest exercises. Now I'm sure he did many more exercises than are shown in this video, but commonly he talks about 3, which are the barbell flat press, the barbell incline press, and flies, specifically dumbbell and cable. So we'll go over both of those, but those are the 3 main categories. So without further ado, let's break it down. Let's talk about specifically what Arnold's doing in each of these motions and why. So the first motion we'll go over is the barbell bench press. Now, many of you immediately, just before this even plays, are going to notice a couple of interesting things. The first thing you'll notice is the width of his arms, right? His arms are not super narrow here. The second thing you'll notice is, if I let the video play, how much range of motion, or really how little range of motion, he uses. Now, many of you may say, oh, bro, you're not using full ROM. What are you doing? But many of you also at this point may have heard about this little concept called lengthened partials. And guess what? Arnold was way, way, way ahead of his time, as were many other bodybuilders. So we'll talk about that in just a second. The first thing to note about a wider arm path in general, specifically as it relates to the bench press, is just the fact that when you are this big, right, when your rib cage is this sort of barrel shaped, when you have lats that are this big, when you have triceps that are this big, stuff just starts to run into stuff, right? And so if you are trying to press with a grip that's somewhere in here at shoulder width, it's number one, it's going to be really awkward. And number two, if you do have a narrow grip and you are trying to train your chest, you're going to sort of be forced to drive your elbows down. In other words, if I let this play, you're going to be forced to drive your elbows down, sort of, instead of being out here like Arnold's arms are, you're going to be forced to drive them sort of this way. Unless you want it to just become a triceps exercise where you're basically just doing like a press where your hands are inward toward your shoulder and your elbows are driving outward. So big takeaway here is Arnold is using a wider arm path, I believe, for 2 main reasons. One is just the bulk of stuff here. It's more comfortable for him. 2, it's actually a little bit more specific to the upper portions of the chest, right? Because when you drive your arm out a little bit more widely this way, let this camera just change the view, scroll forward maybe just a little bit. There we go. The upper arm is going to align, think about it, just in terms of the anatomy of the chest, a little bit more with the upper portions of the middle pec, and then the upper pecs, which are obviously on top of this. You can't really see them because of how big Arnold's chest is. But if you look at a picture of the chest and just like lay out, I'll just throw up an anatomy diagram here. If you move your arm out a little bit more widely, what you'll notice is that your arm moves parallel more toward the upper portions of the pecs. So in my estimation, Arnold was probably feeling a lot of his middle chest and a lot of his upper chest in this exercise rather than his lower chest. Now, his chest is so big that he was probably feeling all of it, and he was, as he talks about, very well connected with the squeeze and all that stuff. So I'm sure he was feeling a lot of it. The other thing to note about the range of motion is specifically the fact that when we use free weight implements to do presses, even with barbells, right, barbells and dumbbells mainly, the bottom half of this motion is going to be where a majority of what is called torque or resistance torque is going to be on the shoulder, which is basically just a fancy way to say this is where it's actually challenging, is pretty much the bottom portion of the range. Because when we get to the top of a press, a free weight press, I'll pause this for a sec, the resistance direction's a little bit deceptive in this case, but if you have your arms out this wide, there's actually a lot of friction on the bar that is pushing your hand backward this way. So unlike, just drawing a normal force diagram where you would draw like an arrow downward that way, and you would draw like moment arm to the elbow, moment arm to the shoulder. Don't worry about those terms if you're not familiar with them. Because there's a lot of friction or really picture like the hand wants to kind of slide outward that way. The friction of the bar is going to push him pretty significantly this way. And so instead of the force being directed downward, it's kind of more like directed this way to some degree, right? And what that essentially means is that toward the top portion of the range, there's very, very little resistance on the shoulder and the elbow, meaning that toward the top end of the range where these elbows are locked, there's not a lot of challenge. And so Arnold just milks sort of greases the groove, milks the bottom portion of the range so that he's really just focused on his chest. And maybe a simpler way to think about this is if you watch the motion of this bone, right? This bone is going to be the thing that pumps the bar upward and that lowers the bar downward, because this segment right here, this lever, this called the humerus, the upper arm, is going to be the thing that is pivoting, right? So look at Arnold's upper arms, just watch his biceps, right? All the motion of the biceps is basically the thing that is pushing the bar, right? Notice how subtle is a really cool thing. Notice how subtle the change in angle of his elbow is, like toward the bottom. It's basically all just motion of the shoulder that is pushing the bar upward. So some interesting things to take away here is use a grip that's comfortable for you. Don't get too caught up in, do I use the same grip Arnold did? No. Find the grip that's comfortable for you, and I guarantee Arnold would tell you to do that. A little bit wider will probably be a little bit more specific to the upper portions of the pecs, while a little bit more narrow might be more specific to the middle and lower portions of the pecs. Of course, that also depends on sort of what you do with your torso, but as a general rule of thumb, those are sort of good thoughts. And then in addition, if you are doing a free weight press and you are having trouble connecting with your pecs, use just the bottom half of the range. Again, it's not partial range of motion, it's full range of motion really for where the pecs are being primarily challenged. Okay, those are some major takeaways. Now, the last thing, just as a little tidbit here, is that Arnold does actually use a false grip. Right, so look at the hand here and notice how he doesn't have his thumb wrapped around. I wouldn't necessarily recommend that to everyone in a blanket sort of way, but if you are really skilled and really comfortable with the motion, using a false grip like that can really free up some motion at your forearm and hand, and it can just make it more comfortable. So I would probably recommend, if you're going to try that, try to do it on like a Smith machine first, where there's very low risk, right? You can just rack the bar that way if something bad happens. And then maybe if you're interested, integrate it with some barbell stuff. Just be careful doing it and make sure that you're doing it under control. Moving on to exercise number 2, we have the incline barbell press. Now, I want to just point out briefly before we actually start to watch the mechanics and break down the mechanics of this motion, that as Arnold is getting set up, notice that he's looking in the mirror. Now, yeah, was he looking in the mirror maybe just to check himself out? Yeah, I mean, if I looked like Arnold, I probably would too. But notice what he's doing, what he's paying attention to. I believe his eyes are dead set on basically the relationship between his forearm and the barbell. And what you'll notice is that the way that he sets his forearms up, at least initially, is basically aligned so that he's roughly 90 degrees underneath of the bar. I think that's a really, really great recommendation for a barbell press if you're trying to train your chest, for a lot of different reasons, mostly just because it's going to be one of the most chest-involved things. Now, you might ask, well, Ben, why is he sort of aligning his forearm 90 degrees, whereas with the flat press, he kind of, like, if this was the bar, he had his angled, or he had his forearm kind of angled really, really wide, right? Remember, he took that wider grip. Well, if you actually watch the motion here and watch what happens when he presses the bar out, notice that in the top portion of the range, boom, that forearm now moves at a little bit more of an angle again. So Arnold was definitely like a wider grip presser. And I think that for many people have been taught to do that 90-degree forearm thing. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. I think, as I mentioned, it's a great strategy, heuristic for setting up a strong press. But don't be afraid to go a little bit wider. Don't be afraid to experiment with what that feels like. Many of you who feel like a lot of triceps and front delts may feel a lot better with a slightly wider grip. For a couple different reasons, just the mechanics make it so that, as I mentioned with the flat press video, the humerus is going to be the main thing to move. The elbow doesn't necessarily have to do as much in that particular case. But anyway, in terms of the actual execution here, I think this is a really cool angle to see, because a lot of people just assume that incline press is purely an upper pec thing, and there's no doubt that there's a lot of upper pec involvement, there's a lot of front delt involvement, but that's really going to depend highly. I mentioned earlier like a little tidbit about the trunk and the position of the trunk and how it matters. Notice how arched Arnold's back is. This is not me representing the spine, but just me representing sort of the shape of his chest and what really has to work to actually perform this press. So imagine he drives his arm sort of down in this way. This is not the perfect angle to look at this at, I think, but it'll sort of make a point. Because his chest is so massive and so sloped, right, his incline press is actually probably a little bit more specific to the middle portions of the pec, just because those portions of the pecs are going to be the things that are most directly pulling upward. Think about it this way. If the arm is getting smushed this way, whatever is sort of in line to pull it up this way is going to be the thing to do the most amount of work, right? So his lower pecs, which are sort of running in this direction, are not going to contribute as much. But if we broke that down in the bottom portion of the range, hopefully there's a freeze frame here. Yeah, it'll fade a little bit, but notice what happens in the bottom. I know this is faded because the video was ending that I recorded this from, but look at this portion of his pec here. You can see this lower pec. This lower pec, as Arnold moves his arms downward, is actually still pulling more vertically than people think, which is why this whole arch thing is actually quite relevant when it comes to training the chest, because the more that you can kind of pull, oh, here's a better angle. The more it's average. The more that you can pull this chest up, right? Just imagine I'll draw the chest sort of through here, right? So here's Arnold's chest. Whoop, whoop, whoop. The more that you can pull this chest upward, the more that upper pecs can pull up, the more that middle pecs can pull up, and the more that lower pecs, despite the fact that it's an incline, right? In essence, what he's doing is he's making it less of an incline by arching the hell out of his back. but he's choosing a position that is comfortable for him, whereas a flat press for some people might not be. A flat press, for whatever reason, might be uncomfortable for people's shoulders in the bottom. An incline press tends to be a little bit less offensive if you have shoulder issues, just because of the angle of the press and specifically how the resistance may change. It's a little bit less heavy toward the bottom portion of the range as compared to something like a flat press. But nevertheless, I think those are the major things to point out. Number one, we covered sort of the range of motion and the grip, and specifically why I think he likes to angle his grip that way. And then also just this idea of creating that arch to train more than just the upper portions of the pecs, right? He's getting a lot of his pecs involved here. And if any of you have seen research, there is some research to suggest that yes, the lower pecs do indeed grow from an incline press. And this is a great reason why. So a big takeaway from this portion of the video is that incline does not equal upper, right? How you set up relative to the incline equals whatever portion of the pecs are really most in line with the direction of resistance. So if Arnold, instead of arching the hell out of his back here, like this, so that his chest ended up this way. Imagine if you or someone else was a flatter sternumed person where your chest was kind of more at this angle. Well, yeah, then your upper pecs would kind of be the thing to do the work, and your lower pecs would be pulling really, really far out of line with where the resistance is. So if you're someone who has that more flattened chest, see actually how training your spine and extension, like practice like arching your spine outside of the context of a press, and then see how creating that spinal extension motion, that chest arching motion, making your chest bigger, feels during this kind of a press. Ultimately, you just want to make sure that your intentions are in line with your goals. So if you did want to make this more upper pec specific, you wouldn't probably want to arch this much. And if you wanted to make it more lower pec specific, you would want to just choose a different direction of resistance altogether, like a decline press or something similar. All right, so moving on to the dumbbell fly. Now, a lot of people call this a dumbbell fly. If you look at the way that Arnold does this, it's not really a fly in the traditional sense. And the reason I say that is because if you watch what he's doing with his upper arms, I'll skip to this part, you'll kind of notice that, number one, he's keeping his elbows really, really bent for most of the range. And then number two, he's also kind of like treating it like a press after he's treating it like a fly in the bottom. So it's kind of like fly toward the bottom and then fly press as he comes upward. I think that's for a couple of reasons, mostly just because if you try to keep your elbows straight in something like a fly, it just feels really awkward. You basically will take the biceps, right, which have an attachment across the shoulder, right? So biceps right here. If Arnold were to take his forearm and straighten it out this way, right, so his elbow angle were straight, not only would the weight be so much farther away from him and it would be harder and more awkward to control, but also just these biceps right here, they run and attach across the shoulder. So if he lets his arm fall this way so that his elbow is straight, he's fully stretching the biceps from the perspective of the elbow, right? And then he would also be dragging his shoulder back behind his body, which would stretch them from the shoulder. So a lot of people feel like weird biceps things, weird coracobrachialis things, which is basically just to say like weird stuff around the biceps area. And that could be a primary reason why. And so if you're someone who doesn't like love the dumbbell flat press, but you also don't love the dumbbell fly, try this out. I think this is a really cool alternative. And I think this is a really good solution to any of you who may have problems with flies, specifically dumbbell flies, which tend to be, by the way, really, really heavy in the bottom and really, really light in the top. Why? Well, because when Arnold gets to the top right here, the resistance, it's not a good angle to show it, right? But it basically falls directly downward through his shoulder where he doesn't really have to actually do anything. Right, and many of you will feel this intuitively and know this intuitively that when you get to the bottom of this press, right, fly thing, that this is going to be the heaviest portion of the motion. Why? Well, because if you looked at where the dumbbell is over here, it's basically as far from the shoulder as it possibly could be. Now, some tidbits and some other commentaries on this. Again, what we discussed with the arching thing is still going to hold consistent here. Like, look how big he's making his chest. Why is this important for Arnold in this context? Well, look at the angle. Look how it's just absolutely insane how long his pecs are and just like where they attach, right? This is his lower pec here. This is his upper pec pulling here. And this is his middle pec pulling here. So it's just like when the arm is this far behind the body this way, and when he's getting that deep of a stretch in motion, all of these three guys have to like work like hell to basically pull the arm up. And if we looked at this from the side, which would determine sort of which pec he's working most, it might be possible that like he's training most of his middle and lower pecs in this instance just because of how high he's pulled his chest. Again, remember that whole arching concept. The higher that you pull your chest, in essence, the more that you're making a motion, a decline motion. And so I just think this is a really cool thing to witness because someone might look at this and see a flat angle and assume that it's like, oh, maybe it's a middle pec thing. No, but based on the way he's structured his setup here and his execution here, I think it's largely like a middle lower pec thing. Not to say that the upper portions of the pec aren't involved, because again, as I'll repeat, someone like Arnold with that big of a chest, it's kind of hard to get rid of any of the pecs, or to not be specific to all the pecs just because of how barrel-chested he is. But this is a really great alternative, again, just insofar as the cueing. Keep the elbows bent. Imagine that you're doing not a press and not a fly, but kind of a hybrid between the two. I think a lot of you will actually really, really like this a lot, especially if you're someone who feels like a lot of triceps, generally speaking, in all your presses. All right, so I just wanted to cover sort of one more variation, right? Still a fly, but rather just a cable fly, to kind of show a difference in angle and a difference in execution. So here he's able to, or really allowing his elbows to be a bit straighter.
Hey everyone, it's me. One thing I forgot to mention about this particular variation of a fly is I think that Arnold keeps his elbows straighter in this position, because if you look at the top position, the cable is basically pulling parallel to his arm, meaning that, if you imagine your arm is getting pulled backward by a dumbbell, there's a lot more resistance on the shoulder in that position. Like I mentioned, the bottom of a dumbbell fly or the fly press variation he's doing is really, really heavy in that position. But if the cable is just sort of pulling his arm outward in that direction, there's not really much force on the shoulder. So that's my estimation as to why he keeps his elbows and his arms sort of more straight in this bottom position, because the cable fly variation he's doing is a lot more challenging toward the squeeze position, which is complementary to the dumbbell variation that we just looked at.
And this isn't the best of videos, right? All these are obviously like old school videos I just pulled from YouTube. But I want you all to notice the angle here that his arm is getting pulled. So his arm's getting pulled this way and this way, right? So you ask, just from, again, a mechanics standpoint, what the hell is doing the most amount of work? Well, this is his lower pecs and his portion of his middle pecs. Here are his upper pecs over here. His lower pecs are directly, boom, in line with where that resistance is pulling him. And if I erase these two things and I allow this to play, watch where he drives his arms, and boop, right in line with that arrow that I just drew right here, right? In other words, if you imagine sort of where those lower pec fibers are directing in this top position, notice that he's bringing his arms right down in this fiber direction to target those lower pecs. So a good heuristic for targeting the lower pecs is use a resistance that is trying to pull your arm upward and backward, because these are the things that pull your arm downward and forward. If you're trying to target these upper portions of the pecs, what would Arnold have to do? Well, he would have to angle the resistance kind of a little bit more this way, like backward rather than sort of outward. And what he would have to do is he would have to drive his hands forward kind of more toward his chin, because right over here is where those upper pecs and those upper portions of the middle pecs are going to insert. And then if he wanted to do something in between, instead of driving his arm down here or instead of driving his arm over here, again, with a resistance that was either this way for the lower pecs or a little bit more backward for the upper pecs, he would want to drive his arm sort of right in the middle ground between those two things. So middle pec is kind of like find the hybrid between lower and upper. And for the upper, again, general rules, just make sure that that resistance, much like the initial bench press we went over, is in line with where that wider arm path is moving. For lower pecs, make sure that angle is high to low. Middle pec, something in between will do just fine. And then I wanted to show one more angle here just to sort of illustrate that concept, right? A little bit hard to see. I apologize for this angle, but notice, and this is the same exercise, right? Just filmed from a different perspective. This, I mean, it's just crazy how absolutely massive these segments are. This is basically his upper pecs and the upper portion of the shelf of the middle pec, and then this is the dividing line of his lower pecs. And you can see that, again, if you imagine this is kind of how the resistance is pulling him, then the thing that has to pull you down from that position is going to be these fibers here, right? So it's not probably much of a surprise to many of you, but it's basically the following sort of process. It's like, hey, let's line up the resistance with whatever portion of the pec I'm trying to train. Let's move in the direction that each of those fibers pull. Again, the lower pecs pulling high to low, middle pecs somewhere in between, upper pecs a little bit wider and sort of inward toward the clavicle. And all those things can be trained really, really well on free weight presses where you're really emphasizing the bottom portion of the motion. But again, even someone like Arnold, use cables. I know a lot of people these days like to poop on cables and say the cables won't make it big. It's all free weights. Well, look at Arnold Schwarzenegger. He used cables and I think he did just fine. So if you enjoyed this breakdown, please let me know, and please let me know who you would like me to break down next, which exercises specifically, which bodybuilders, or just which people sort of in the public space. I'd be happy to take any recommendations and do something similar for other people.